Hello, this is Dr. Kramer, and this is a lecture called The Basics of Rhetoric. It's also a review of the Aristotelian Appeals. It says English 1301 because I used this slideshow in 1301. So if you were in English 1301 with me fairly recently, then you probably could skip this lecture video. However, if it's been a while since 1301, or you're rusty on Aristotle, if you just need some extra reinforcement, then go ahead and watch this video. There is no lecture transcript for this video, but if you need closed captioning, what you can do is you can click on the video, double click on it from Canvas, and watch it on YouTube where there will be closed captioning. Okay, I want to start off with talking about the word rhetoric. At some colleges, this class is called Rhetoric 1302 instead of English 1302. So what is rhetoric? It has kind of a bad connotation nowadays, and people think it means something like tricky speech, like if I'm trying to fool you, or political speech, or speech that doesn't really mean what it's saying. But in the Western tradition, rhetoric is the faculty for observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. And that's a quote from Aristotle. So my goal with rhetoric is persuasion, that's for sure. What I'm doing when I am applying rhetoric successfully is I am looking for the best means of persuading my audience. Rhetoric is a very old subject of study. It was one of the trivium, which are the three original liberal arts in Western universities. The other two are grammar and logic, in case you're wondering. And it was considered a civic art throughout much of Western history. A civic art means something that citizens should know how to do. So citizens should know how to persuade. In ancient times, in ancient Greece and Rome, and even earlier than that, eloquent speaking was a valued accomplishment, and you can see that across the world. In fact, in China, Confucius advised studying poetry to learn how to speak beautifully and persuasively. And of course, as a literature expert, that makes me very, very happy. Ancient religious books use rhetoric. It's certainly in the Bible, so it's not, we may think of it badly now, but it was not considered badly back in ancient times. Originally, rhetoric was used mainly for political and legal persuasion, and it later focused on courtly and religious audiences. So if you think back to the first democracy, that in Athens, every man born in Athens over a certain age was required to take part in government. So it was a true democracy. And they were expected to know how to persuade their fellow citizens and also how to listen and analyze persuasion. Later on, rhetoric became more used in courts. So if you think of a king or a duke or a queen and their court, and then of course religious audiences. There was a shift in the Middle Ages and Renaissance from oral rhetoric to written rhetoric as letter writing becomes a more important medium of communication. So we don't think of letter writing as a technology nowadays, but it definitely was one. And now I can communicate and I can persuade someone many, many miles away from me through the written word. In the Enlightenment, Francis Bacon and John Locke advocated for what they called scientific rhetoric, which is a plainer style. And this is still with us today in American academic style, which I'll talk about in just a moment. The American and French revolutions looked back towards ancient Greece and Rome for political inspiration and revived political rhetoric. So if you think about Washington, D.C. and the architecture of the buildings there, they are all in the neoclassical mode of architecture, meaning they look like ancient Greek and Roman buildings. This is not the case if you go to London and see the Houses of Parliament. Even though they were built in the 1800s, they actually are made to look like medieval buildings. So whereas England is looking back towards the Middle Ages for its source of inspiration, in the U.S. and in France, we are looking back towards ancient Greece and Rome. And so this caused a revival of political rhetoric. And nowadays, rhetoric is an important course of study in universities. I mentioned before, sometimes it is just called rhetoric. It is called that at UTD. So this class at UTD would be RHET 1302 instead of ENGL 1302. Some colleges might call it communication studies. When I taught at SMU, it was called discourse and discernment. So it could be called all different kinds of things, but it is all rhetoric. Let me talk to you today also a little bit about American academic style. I do count a style grade when I grade essays, and what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be kind of comparing your writing to how it fits in with the model, which is American academic style. American academic style is American and academic, which seems kind of obvious, but let's talk a little bit about what that means. American meaning other countries and other traditions, cultural traditions, have their own style of rhetoric, and that is perfectly fine. This is not a value judgment. I am just going to be teaching you how to write in an American university setting. And then academic style versus casual style or even literary style. Academic style has its own kind of genre features, and that's what we're going to be conforming to when we are writing in this class. So what are the components of American academic style, and what will I be grading your writing for in terms of style? Well, first, whoops, sorry about that, a little bit too far. First would be directness. So in some cultures, and we'll talk about this in a week or two when I give you the cultural differences lecture, some cultures find directness to be rude. Americans do not find directness to be rude. We value directness. For that reason, your thesis should come out and say what you want to argue, even if you haven't proven it yet. And so if your thesis is not direct, if you are not being direct in your argumentation, you will get a note about directness. Objectivity is important in American academic style. This means that it at least appears that you've looked at all sides of an issue. So we're going to remove language that makes it seem like we came into our writing with a bias. We're going to do counter-argument, and we're going to be objective and present facts to support our opinions. Okay, again, this is an American academic value. Something called reasonability is also part of American academic style. This means we're arguing with medium certainty. We are hedging our claims a bit. And how this really comes into play in this class is you don't want to go out and make a universalist statement like, you know, all people of this ethnicity think this way, vote this way, value this, etc. We want to only argue with medium certainty, realizing that there are exceptions to the rule, hedging our claims a little bit, qualifying our argument. We'll get into this more later when we talk about thesis statements, but reasonability is a big thing. So how you might get counted off against on this in terms of style is if you make these kind of universalist statements using words like all, never, always, none, etc. We want to stay away from those in American academic style. And then finally, conciseness or concision. And so the style textbook that you have for this class will help you with conciseness, and we will definitely be talking about it. In fact, when we talk about nominalizations this week, we are talking about conciseness. Okay. Whenever we are looking at a piece of rhetoric, so when you are analyzing, for example, these culture essays that you've been looking at, we always need to keep in mind the rhetorical situation. In other words, what's the context? And so I have this little graphic here. My kids like to call this the Illuminati graphic. It's not meant to freak you out and imply that I know something you don't. This is just a traditional visualization of the rhetorical situation. Okay, we have the message, so what I want to say. The author, that's important to consider. Who is the author? Are they an expert? What's their age? What's their background? What else have they written? The audience, who are they writing to? Are they writing to a hostile audience? Are they writing to an audience that is likely to agree with them? Are they writing to an ignorant audience. I'm going to ask you to write to an intelligent but ignorant audience. All right. And then in the middle of the triangle is something called purpose. So most of the writing that you yourself will do in my class will be persuasive in purpose. But when you are analyzing something, you always have to figure out, okay, is this here to entertain me? Is it here to give me information? Is it a persuasive piece? Is it a literary piece, etc.? So we always want to consider the purpose in the rhetorical situation. Again, if you've had English 1301, you might have seen this little graphic before, and you might have talked about the rhetorical situation. All right, I now want to talk about Aristotle and the Aristotelian model of rhetoric. You see Aristotle there and his dates 364 to 322 BCE. Aristotle had a lot of opinions about a lot of things, and you probably have encountered his appeals before, whether you encountered them in 1301 or in high school. But I have a few things that I may add on to your background knowledge of Aristotle's appeals. He argued that there were three basic appeals, or artistic proofs is what he called them, that writers and speakers can use to support an argument. And the first is logos. And we see there in the word logos, the same root word that gives us the word logic. This is argument by logic. Okay? So anytime I use numbers, facts, the results of scientific experiments, etc., I am appealing to logic. Now, within all the tools that I have in logic, I have a very powerful tool called concession. And we're going to use this when we write our last paper to concede a point. What is concession? It's accepting what the other person says and then building on it. And so if you're in a disagreement with someone about how to solve a problem, acknowledging that their point of view has some validity and talking about its strengths and then building on those strengths and turning the argument back to your solution, that's going to be a very, very powerful way to argue. And so when we write our last paper, you'll have to include a section of the paper that gives counter-argument, which is the other side or concession, and then refutation. And that's where you turn the argument back to your point of view. Okay? There is not much concession going around nowadays, as you can probably tell. Of course, social media does not really lend itself to concession, but this is something that you'll need to be able to do for this class. So I have this little very simple ad here that is a logos appeal. You'll see that it's using numbers. It has a claim that USA Today is still #1 in print circulation, but then it backs it up with facts. And then it even tells you the source down here of the study that it did. Okay, so it still has slogans, it still has some graphics, but it also has facts to back it up. It is appealing to logos. The second Aristotelian appeal is pathos. This is the same root of the words pathetic or sympathy. This is argument by emotion. Also, it's most of the way that you usually argue with your family, probably, if you're like me. The most powerful tool in your toolbox, if you're using pathos, is sympathy. You see, the word literally means feeling with someone. You want to align your emotions with your audience. So, for example, sometimes I will have dual credit high school students that email me and they are very, very concerned about their grade. I had a student one semester that was concerned she was falling behind because she had a 95 in my class. Now, I'm thinking, because I've been a college teacher for many years, hey, 95 is a pretty darn good grade in a dual credit class, especially since you're working 2 years ahead, and I haven't dumbed this class down any. And I want to kind of laugh this off and tell her to stop being a grade Nazi. But that really wouldn't be an effective way to convince the student not to be worried about her grade. Instead, I need to align my emotions with that audience. So I might say something like, hey, Allison, I know you're concerned about falling behind. I know that this class may seem overwhelming. I know that junior year is a very difficult year and you take a lot of hard classes junior year, but you are doing fine in this class. 95 is an excellent grade. So you see how I'm kind of going to align my emotions with my fictitious student Allison and not laugh at her or get angry with her. That would not be effective use of pathos. All right. So most ads about animals use pathos in some way. So we see this ad here for the Humane Society. The kind of thing that most draws students when I've used this lecture in an in-person class is the picture of the dog and his face, and also the word victim hanging there right above the dog. Now the dog, they could have had any kind of picture of a dog, a smiling dog, a sleeping dog. Instead, they have a dog giving us sad eyes, which we all know dogs are very good at giving. Then we have the use of text there, victim in large font, hanging right above the dog. And then even that shadow that looks like a man with his hand in a fist, and the words violent family written across him, that is also use of pathos. Okay. If you've ever had to change the channel on the TV because they've got that Sarah McLachlan Arms of the Angels song and the sick little puppies and kittens looking at you, then you have been effectively stirred by pathos. All right, the third appeal is ethos. This is not argument by ethics, although it's close. It is argument by character. This was considered to be the most powerful appeal by Aristotle. Now, you might disagree with him, but I would submit to you, think of all the politicians who try to break down their opponent's character. This is because they know that ethos is very powerful. The most powerful kind of aspect of ethos for your audience, if you want to be effective, is something called decorum. Now, decorum is a word that might conjure up pictures of people having tea with the queen and sticking their little pinkies out as they tip the teacup up to their lips. That's part of it in some audiences. But what the word decorum means in this case is fitting in with what the audience expects you. Okay, so acting the way the audience expects you to act. So, if I am trying to convince a bunch of motorcycle gang members to take my route on our cross-country trip to Sturgis next summer, I am going to talk their language. I am not going to dress up in high heels and a business suit. I'm going to wear my motorcycle leathers. I might do some cursing. I'm going to have my hair all crazy because I've been riding my motorcycle around. I'm going to look tough, okay? But if I am giving a speech to a bunch of grandma-aged ladies, I am not going to show up dressed like a motorcycle gang member, right? So decorum is fitting in with what the audience expects you to be. 3 more essential qualities of ethos according to Aristotle. This idea of virtue or cause, that the audience believes you share their values. Okay? This idea of practical wisdom, the speaker or writer knows what to do on every occasion. And finally, the idea of disinterest, which in this case means lack of bias. So, going back to my motorcycle gang example, and I'm trying to convince my fellow motorcycle gang members to take a particular route to Sturgis this summer when we're on our big motorcycle trip. And everybody knows that my brother owns a restaurant that goes through this town that we're going to be going through right about dinner time. They're not going to believe that I'm disinterested or that I lack bias. They're going to be thinking, yeah, this girl just wants to get her brother's business a bunch of money, and also maybe she gets a kickback, right? So we need to make sure that we show disinterest when we are using the ethos appeal. And that's another reason why, going back to American academic style, that we want to show objectivity. Okay. All right, so here's an ad that would not be allowed to appear today. This is an old ad. The pixelation is pretty bad, so you can't read the little stuff that's in the yellow. But basically, we see here a doctor. He's an older doctor, so that kind of connotes wisdom He's in his white lab coat, but he's got a tie on underneath. But he's smoking. Now, I'm not saying that doctors don't smoke. Some do. In fact, I caught my kid's dentist one time eating a candy bar when I happened to see him in a different area of the hospital. So obviously, doctors, dentists, etc. are people too and do some unhealthy things, right? But nowadays, we would not see a doctor doing a cigarette commercial. In fact, the doctor would probably be hiding the fact that he smoked. But here we see a doctor being used in a cigarette ad because people trust doctors. People tend to trust older doctors more sometimes because they have more experience. If this doctor is smoking a Camel, that must mean that this is the safest and best cigarette for me. Okay, this ends the review of Aristotle's Appeals, the rhetorical situation, and American academic style.